Wisconsin Green Fire supports Wisconsin's conservation legacy by promoting science-based management of Wisconsin natural resources. This series is brought to you by FWSP Explorers, also known as We Go Camping. It is being shown with permission from Wisconsin Green Fire after getting the permission to show this video. The 4-part series features a trio of expert panelists talking about wolf management in Wisconsin. The history of wolves and wolf management in Wisconsin features an inclusive and transparent process that is essential to effective wolf management. What public perceptions of wolves can tell us about coexistence and how our neighbor Minnesota is managing its resident wolf population. Panelists are Adrian from WGF Wildlife, he's the co-chair there, Jody from the Midwest Environmental Advocates, and Peter from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife. All right, Randy. People walked by and I was like, there's people.
Good morning and welcome to our conservation webinar, Opportunities for Collaboration, a Shared Vision for Wolves in Wisconsin, hosted by Wisconsin's Green Fire. My name is Sarah Wilkins and I'm Science Director for Wisconsin's Green Fire. We're joined today by our Executive Director, Fred Clark, who will be helping the webinar run smoothly. We're also joined by our WGF co-chair for our Wildlife Work Group, Tom Hauge. We're very happy that you could join us today. We have a lot of people from all over the country, which is fantastic. We're here for a great conversation with a fantastic panel on wolves and wolf management in Wisconsin. I'll be introducing our esteemed panel very shortly. Before I do that, I'd like to give you a short introduction to Wisconsin's Green Fire. We support the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management of natural resources. We are one of Wisconsin's strongest voices for science and conservation, and our members work throughout the state on issues including wildlife, fisheries, water resources, forests, farms, and working lands, the science of climate change and how we respond to it, as well as our path to renewable energy. To learn more about how you can join, to donate, or collaborate with Wisconsin's Green Fire, we encourage you to visit us at www.wigreenfire.org. You can also find us on Facebook. So next I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Peter David, and Peter works as a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, also referred to as GLFWC. At the Commission, Peter has learned a lot from tribal elders through the sharing of traditional ecological knowledge and has had the opportunity to work with a variety of natural resources, or more than just human beings, in the Ojibwe worldview. This includes waterfowl, wetlands, wild rice, and wolves. Peter earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, first of all, to Green Fire for the opportunity to serve on the panel today. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in as well to listen to this. Appreciate that very much. I'm going to try to present this sort of in the Ojibwe tradition and just give an oral talk, a presentation. So I'm going to be PowerPointless, but I hope the presentation itself isn't pointless. I think many of you have some familiarity with the Ojibwe's cultural relationship with Mayengan, or the wolf. But we do have people in the audience from around the country, so I think it's important for me to touch on this topic, however briefly and inadequately as I'm likely to do this. But in very brief, Mayengan plays a critical role in the Ojibwe creation story. In that telling, the first or original person was placed on the earth only after all the rest of creation had been placed here, because he was completely dependent upon the rest of creation for his survival. However, he eventually came to be rather lonely in spirit, and when he talked to the Creator about that, the Creator responded by introducing him to Mayengan to walk and to talk and to play with. And they became brothers, and they became beings that would share a common fate in this Ojibwe telling. So this telling and other related stories still form the foundation for the Ojibwe's understanding of what our relationship with wolves should be today. And it's also what's really behind the tenet that the Ojibwe hold a sacred responsibility to consider the Mayengan's best interest in the things that they do. I also need to talk briefly about the treaties, especially again for people who may not be familiar with this from other areas. But there are 11 tribes that are members of Glifwick. They were all co-signatory to specific treaties in the mid-1800s that covered large land areas that later became parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And areas really interestingly that greatly overlap with where wolves have come to be recovered in the Midwest. And while the usufructuary or the use rights that the tribes reserved under those treaties came largely to be forgotten or ignored over time, they were, again, eventually recognized and reaffirmed by the United States Supreme Court. And that is a case that is often referred to in brief as the Voigt case. Now, there are thousands of pages of court documents that came out of Voigt and extensive stipulations about the management, the biology, or the stewardship of species like deer and walleye. Wolves are scarcely mentioned, and you might wonder why. But the reason really is that the parties in the Voigt case were the tribes and the state of Wisconsin, not the federal government. And wolves at the time were not only few in number in Wisconsin, essentially zero when the case started, and just about 17 years later when the final judgment was entered, but they were under federal regulation. And so there wasn't that much that the state could stipulate to. But there was one important stipulation, and that was that Glifwick would have representation on basically all state wildlife species committees, including those that dealt with wolves. And this is important because while the primary relationship between the state and the tribes must be conducted on a government-to-government level, and I can't stress that enough, a great deal of management or stewardship discussion and data sharing takes place within these special committees. And it's really important that the tribes be at the table. It doesn't replace government-to-government consultation, and it should never be misconstrued to give people the idea that the tribes are just another special interest group or stakeholder group that the state needs to consider. But it is an important second tier of communication at a staff-to-staff level that I think and hope is beneficial to everybody involved. When I first began working at Glifwick, Voigt was still in the courts. And I've always said that one of the biggest parts of my education as a biologist was going to work for the tribes in the middle of litigation, because one of the primary activities in those early years was to discuss the tome of state harvest regulations and try to determine which ones were founded on biology and which ones were actually driven primarily by culture or worldview. And it was the first time in my life, I guess, that I stepped far enough back from my own culture to become aware of how much of what I had sort of traditionally considered biology was really an expression of my own culture's worldview. And that was a worldview that embraced things like sport harvest, fair chase, and human dominion over other beings. And it was enlightening for me, to say the least. I bring you this background today, not to drag you through my life story, but because I think it's really an important lesson in the way we should proceed in wildlife stewardship today, and not just in the realm of wolves. But it turns out that once upon a time, wolf management in the Wisconsin DNR functioned in a way that sort of embraced some of this separation of biological and social concerns. As Adrian introduced in his talk, in the early years of wolf recovery in Wisconsin, most wolf management was directed by this, what was then called the Wolf Advisory Committee, which was people really by biologists who were applying the best available science. Of course, few parts of wildlife management are more influenced by social concerns than things dealing with the wolf. And so when wolf numbers in the state finally grew, a separate wolf stakeholders committee was created. And the name of that original group was changed to the Wolf Science Committee. This large stakeholder group was diverse, it was balanced, and it was given the opportunity to express its concerns. And many times efforts were made to accommodate those concerns. The 350 number that's in the existing Wisconsin Wolf Management Plan is one example of that. That number was not the original recommendation of the Science Committee. Now, these separate committees, I think, were a very good way of doing business. And in my humble opinion, it's really the only way it should be done for areas where state and tribal rights overlap, because it clearly separates biological and social concerns. And that's actually a very critical element of the Voigt decision. However, under the previous administration, these two committees were disbanded and a new one was created. Although the old name of the Wolf Advisory Committee was sort of recycled, this new committee didn't resemble the old one by that name very much, because a large part of the membership was now made up of stakeholder groups. But it turns out that almost all of those stakeholder groups are groups that are generally unsupportive or antagonistic towards wolves. Now, it's not my place to tell the state how to listen to its constituents or which organization should have its ear. But I have served in my professional capacity as sort of a liaison between the tribes and Wisconsin DNR under several different administrations. And I have done some of the same in Minnesota. And I have 3+ decades of experience, I guess, in seeing what works and what doesn't. Now, I haven't shared with you yet what our member tribes' primary positions towards wolf stewardship are. And if I had to sort of limit it to the top 3 points, I think they'd be these. One is allow wolves to determine their own population level on the landscape. There's no legitimate need to suppress a population that's remarkably low, even when it's at carrying capacity. The second thing is to not allow recreational harvest, okay? Until we can at least get to that point in a post-delisted world, the tribes would want the state to close not only the reservations to harvest by state licensees, but roughly a 6-mile buffer area around them so that they can protect wolves that live primarily on the reservation, but occasionally venture off. And most Wisconsin reservations are too small to come close to containing an entire wolf pack. The third point is strong support for an effective livestock depredation program. And the tribes have accepted the judicial application of lethal depredation while favoring non-lethal control where that can be effectively applied. Now, I have been known to say that I thought there may be no area where state and tribes differ more on wildlife stewardship than in the arena of wolves. But recently, I think I've really been coming to rethink that statement. Because while most of the stakeholder groups that are involved in the advisory committee probably considered those positions of the tribes that I just stated as being sort of extreme, it turns out to the public, that's really not the case. And if you want support for that statement, excuse me, I suggest you really please take a look at the most recent wolf attitude surveys that are available for Wisconsin and for Minnesota. I don't have time today to go into the details of those surveys, but the Wisconsin survey was conducted 6 years ago. and found that statewide, among people with an opinion, about 60% of the population, excuse me, about 60% of the population wanted about the same or more wolves than existed in the state at that time. The Minnesota survey was conducted just this year, and I would like to think after 6 more years of public education efforts to shine some light on the historic myths that typically haunt wolves, and found that an amazing 86% of state residents wanted as many or more wolves in that state than currently existed. And that's a state that has a population that currently supports about 2.5 times as many wolves as Wisconsin. I think those kind of attitude surveys indicate that there was a serious flaw in the composition of the Wisconsin Advisory Committee. It didn't reflect the desires of the public as a whole. I think that's unfair to the public, and I think it's unfair to the tribes as well, because I would argue, and this is a personal opinion, but I would argue that the tribes, well, the state is not likely to have a great relationship or appropriate relationship dealing with the tribes until it has an appropriate relationship dealing with its own constituents. Now, the Minnesota Wolf Attitude Survey I just mentioned was conducted in order to inform the update of the Minnesota Wolf Management Plan, which is currently underway. I think that survey itself was a critical step to drafting a plan that addresses broad public interests. The second step is how they constructed the committees that will shepherd that plan's development, and that was committees with an S. Minnesota created a 20-member advisory committee and populated it with very diverse interests, a really broad and balanced group, and you can go onto their website and see who is actually sitting on that committee. Importantly, I think, too, is that there are a number of people on that committee who are actually unaffiliated with organizations, and I think my experience has been that that's going to greatly facilitate the success of that group. Unaffiliated individuals are often more moderate, more flexible, and they're more willing to come towards compromise than people who are embedded in their agency's positions. Minnesota DNR also convened a technical work group, or what might be called a science committee, to review the wolf plan components, provide assessment and evaluation of the plan, make recommendations on things like population monitoring, research, and other aspects of stewardship. So it's sort of like back to the future over there. What would our tribes like to see going forward? Well, certainly the state needs to really embrace this government-to-government relationship with the tribes. And I would suggest that that would include attempting, in a positive and sort of proactive way, the development of a management/stewardship stipulation for wolves, as was done for a number of other species in the white case. I would also encourage the state to return to maintaining these separate science and stakeholder committees, and populating the stakeholder committee with a full range of interests, including some of these non-affiliated individuals. You know, I want to close by saying we've really come a long ways in my lifetime in Wisconsin. The last time Albany was paid to kill a wolf in Wisconsin was just a few years before I was born. Wolves have returned to the state, and although they may number only about 1/3 of what they did when only Native Americans populated this land, their recovery is still ecologically and culturally significant, especially to a people who understand that their fate is tied to that of Mayangans. Maybe most incredibly of all, the false narratives about wolves that have been perpetuated for centuries are finally being replaced, I think, with a truer understanding. And most people in both the tribal and non-tribal communities now hold positive attitudes towards wolves. I think there's a great opportunity right now in Wisconsin and the other states in the Midwest to work with the tribes and to become national and even global leaders in Mayangan stewardship. Miigwech, thank you.